Now, I am honored to introduce Dr. Aylward, who will give the opening keynote. Dr. Aylward is a clinical assessor for the Irish Health Products Regulatory Authority and is the chair of the Pediatric Committee of the European Medicines Agency. The main role of the PETCO is to prospectively guide drug developers on how to consider a medicine's use in children during its development. In this context, the committee assesses the content of pediatric investigation plans. Before joining the HPRA, he practiced as an anesthesiologist and intensive care medicine physician. Prior to his appointment to the PETCO, he was a member of the Clinical Trials Facilitation Group at the Heads of Medicines Agency. Dr. Aylward will speak on the challenges and opportunities to support pediatric drug development across the spectrum of childhood diseases, including particular issues that confront development and registration of drugs for rare diseases. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Aylward for the keynote presentation, Pediatric Regulation Challenges, Big and Small.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Brian Aylward, and I'm the chair of the Pediatric Committee of the European Medicines Agency. I'm delighted to have been invited to go and speak this morning at this symposium, and I'm sorry that I cannot attend in person, but I had a conflicting meeting that I couldn't change. I'm here to go and speak about the pediatric regulation and the challenges that I see currently, both big and small. Just before I start, a quick word about my disclaimer and declarations of interests. All the views that I'm going to present here this morning are my own and do not represent the stated opinion of any competent authority. If I happen to mention any products, they're for illustrative purposes only, and I don't have any conflicts of interest. So this morning, I'm going to focus on three main aspects. First of all, the regulation of precision medicines. And these are medicines that quite often affect small patient populations and may benefit from these big data. I'm going to talk about the evolutionary PIP concept, which we're beginning to go and roll out at the Pediatric Committee to go and help deal with some of the uncertainties that can exist at the early stages of pediatric development. And later I'm going to touch on the network strategy of the European Medicines Agencies and try and illustrate exactly why I think this is important in gathering together a large amounts of stakeholders who can help improve the regulation of pediatric medicines. Now, the concept of precision medicines in pediatric illnesses and rare diseases is not new, and in fact has been driven in no small part by the advances in oncology and the evolution of the paradigm of genetic subtyping. This is also the case in pediatric oncology. But one of the problems that we're well aware of is that quite often these subdivisions of conditions by their genetic subtypes can lead to quite small patient subpopulations, and that in itself can hamper the traditional clinical trial designs of randomized controlled comparative group studies, because quite often the numbers of patients that aren't there, that are maybe have this particular condition aren't there. In addition, the other problem is that quite often these patients can be widely dispersed across the states of the European Union, and that can then lead to collaborative approaches to be necessary amongst both regulators and investigators. And in fact, this is one of the principles on which the clinical trial regulation in 2014 was developed to help improve such collaboration between national competent authorities when it came to authorizing and regulating clinical trials. In addition, one of the other concepts that quite often come is that patients with rare diseases, or in particular in oncology, can benefit from the different combinations of currently existing treatments to drive improvements in their condition. And depending on the stage of the condition of the particular patient, then that can also lead to differences in efficacy, which must be investigated. And this can lead to the generation of large amounts of clinical data, but quite often these data are separate and may need to be aggregated in order to go and allow robust conclusions to be drawn. But which or whether it is quite clear that improved outcomes can occur in what might initially seem to be less rare conditions once these different factors are taken into account. And then it feeds into the paradigm, as I said, of the precision medicines being the right medicine or the right combination of medicines in the right patient, depending on their genetic subtype, and at the right time, either the right time for the patient or the right time within their particular condition. But as I said, one of the issues is that this can lead to trials in quite small patient populations. And these are understandably complicated, not least so, as I said, because of the small numbers can lead to difficulties in the setting up of what might be seen as traditionally robust trials, comparative trials. In addition to that, there's the problem of the perception of equipoise, which might lead investigators and the patients to feel that the newer treatment is better and therefore would be feel less inclined to go and enroll into a trial where they would not get that treatment. This is widespread. This is a common problem across many clinical trials. And even unbiased, unequal allocation may not necessarily solve that. Again, because of the difficulties in the number of patients that would be needed. This can lead to difficulties with comparative analyses, and it will be important for regulators to understand and to be receptive to the idea of innovative statistical analyses that might help show improvements or statistical and clinical improvements as a result of the particular medicines. Those analyses such as Bayesian or incremental analyses. There's been a lot of work done regarding sort of the regulation, the acceptance of these analyses in the recent past, and hopefully that will continue. One of the proposals that applicants and sponsors often come up with is that the idea of a single-arm trial, which is then controlled using historical data. Now, unfortunately, though, we as regulators have found that quite problematic over the recent years for a number of reasons. Quite often the data that is being used as a historical control has come from clinical practice in itself. And unfortunately, with the best will in the world, okay, the information that is generated as part of normal clinical practice may not necessarily be of sufficient quality and robust enough in the same ways that information generated in clinical trials would be more likely to be. It may also be that the information that was collected as part of the normal clinical practice did not contain or measure the endpoints that will be important as part of a clinical trial. And also there's the risk of information being generated at that time not being captured in the same robust manner as it would be expected as part of a clinical trial, both from missing data and errors being put into the medical notes. The other issue that is often highlighted to us is that when developers try to look for these data, the data themselves may not be accessible. And that's quite often because the data are contained within other spheres that they don't have direct control of, be that in the hospital setting, within academia, or in other competitors within their own industry. And that can lead to difficulty in accessing these data. One of the perceived concerns is that has been mentioned is that quite often this can lead to a perception of a conflict of interest for an academic organization if they're linking up with an industry, and that can then lead to them having difficulties accessing other funding streams that they might require. As a result of the difficulty in us accepting the reliability and robustness of the initial data and the lack of the accessibility of these data, it can often be quite difficult for regulators to use these data in the licensing process. And ultimately, it's important that the data on which treatments are being investigated and assessed are reliable and robust. And this is one of the principles contained within the CT regulation, that the data being used in patients should build on reliable and robust data. So much as we might like to use historical controls, if they're not reliable and robust, then unfortunately it makes it difficult for us to go and use them in the way that might be otherwise beneficial. Thankfully, though, that there are processes being put in place at the European level to try and help improve the robustness of databases and to include a common language regarding the description of data and the metadata that is considered important. And on that basis, there have been workshops at the European Medicines Agency and across the European network over the past few years And the outcome of those workshops has now been consolidated and codified into documents regarding the good practice guide for the use of the metadata catalog and also the data quality framework. And those two documents are now out for public consultation. It started about a week or so ago, and the public consultation will go on for a month until the middle of November. And I would encourage anyone who is involved in the field, both academic and industry, to go and engage with these public consultations, as the outcomes of those will then help drive the use of more robust data quality practices within the European Union, and will hopefully reflect these needs and the opinions of the stakeholders for whom they are relevant. This does feed into the ongoing real-world evidence project, which is happening at the European Medicines Agency. And again, this real-world evidence paradigm, I think, will be quite important, and it will be quite useful across the entire product life cycle. I think we're moving to a product life cycle theme regarding the assessment of medicines. It's quite clear that not all the information about the characteristics of medicine will be determined in the pre-authorization phase, and therefore having robust methods of dealing with real-world evidence that is generated will go and help clarify the efficacy and safety of medicines, both overall and in the various different smaller subpopulations, which quite often have different outcomes specific to the characteristics of that subgroup. It is an evolving concept, and again, it would be important for people to try and engage with this, to try and mold it as best we can to our needs. One of the other projects that is also ongoing at the moment is the Darwin project, which is an aggregation of information from databases that has been assessed as being robust. And the benefit of such an aggregation is it allows a larger data pool to be interrogated for questions that can be used within the regulatory framework, such as the prevalence of rare diseases, the use of various different medicines, and so on and so forth. As more databases are generated and set up in a robust manner, then that will then feed back in. This will be a virtuous circle, allowing better information to be used on a population basis. As regards our own regulatory thoughts regarding the use of precision medicines in pediatric illnesses, and which can then be further cascaded into other rare conditions, some members of the Pediatric Committee have recently published a paper outlining a regulatory strategy for supporting childhood cancer therapy developments. And as I said, the principles that are contained within this would be applicable to other rare diseases, so will be quite a useful thing for both academics and industry to go and consider. Moving on, I want to talk about the concept of the evolutionary PIP for a second. And just a bit of background, first of all, the PIP, or the Pediatric Investigation Plan, is the tool that is contained within the regulation to allow developers to clarify what their plans are for the development of the pediatric medicine. Ideally, according to the regulation, it should be submitted or developed and submitted to the agency at the end of the phase 1 studies in adults. And by doing it at that stage, it allows enough time for interactions, early interaction, to give time for the development of the pediatric medicine to occur in parallel with that of adults. And that then allows or minimizes the delay in the authorization of the medicine in pediatrics without unnecessarily delaying the authorization in other groups of patients, such as adults. However, it is understood that sort of the information that is available regarding to pediatrics is incomplete at that stage, and it's therefore understandable that some developers have waited until more definitive information has been generated prior to defining their pediatric development and then coming to the European Medicines Agency for assessment. The difficulty with that, however, is it gives less scope for adjustment of the measures that have already been done, because these have been done, and we don't necessarily want to go and force developers to go and redo steps again unnecessarily. But it also gives less time within the pre-authorization phase for the enactment of the pediatric measures that will need to be done. And that can lead to a risk that the medicine is delayed for in authorization for other populations, or that the measures that are defined for pediatrics would be deferred onto the post-authorization phase, which in then itself can have difficulties regarding the carrying out of those measures, because the medicine quite often might be available in an off-label manner, or which can then reduce the chances of patients being recruited into clinical trials. So there are good reasons for developers coming early with their plans, even if those plans are immature at that stage. One of the other issues, of course, is that there are other regulatory spheres apart from outside of Europe, and depending on the strategy of the particular developer, they may engage with one agency first, agree a plan, start carrying out that plan, then only later come into another agency with a very mature plan that is almost presented as a fait accompli. This can be quite difficult, because then, depending on the opinions within the other regulatory sphere, it may be that the clinical practices are different, and therefore the measures that are contained within that more mature development would not necessarily reflect the guidance documents and the perceptions that are of what is important within that other regulator. So therefore, it is one of the concerns that is often raised by developers, that of the disharmony or the differences in opinion. But I would push that back by saying, well, the earlier you come to any agency, the more time there is for collaboration between agencies to go and sort of work out exactly what is important to those agencies for the local conditions that exist, to allow a more harmonized global development to be agreed. So coming early is always better than coming late. From an EMA perspective, one of the things that is required by the regulations is that the EMA must decide if an applicant has complied with the measures within an agreed PIP, and is that compliance statement that determines whether or not an applicant will ultimately be eligible for any of the rewards that are contained within the regulation. However, one of the difficulty that we have is the EMA, the Pediatric Committee in itself, is not actually able to assess the data that is generated from the PIPs. That is the remit of other structures within the regulatory area. And quite often it can be quite difficult to do a compliance check without assessment if the measures are ill-defined. And one of the other aspect, of course, is that the regulator can't, according to the regulation, oblige developers to come back with the PIP once it has been agreed. So the solution, for want of a better word, that was come up with was to agree or sometimes impose detailed, although possibly arbitrary, measures within the PIP, sometimes as placeholders, which would then require applicants to go and come back with to justify changes to those measures. Applicants understandably feel that this sometimes can be quite restrictive and prescriptive, and therefore the concept of the evolutionary PIP was developed to try and help mitigate that. This concept of the evolutionary PIP has been driven in a large part by the advances within extrapolation that have occurred as part of the ICH revision, which is currently progressing through. So, what is an evolutionary PIP? Just to walk people through. As I said, the best way as I could describe it is that it's a PIP where PIP measures cascade from information that is already known and accepted into measures that are less defined. And those less defined measures can be traced back and are contingent on the known information. And as the development continues on and as the development matures, those unknowns or those less defined measures can evolve and are clarified with the information that has been generated to evolve them into more defined measures. And then that in itself allows applicants to go and proceed within reasonably well-defined, scientifically and mathematically defined tram lines. And then sort of once they generate information, the uncertainty reduces. They can come back, bring this information, and sort of allow the cone of uncertainty to be narrowed and tightened up as the development proceeds. As I said, applicants are ideally supposed to come at the end of their phase 1 studies in adult, the pharmacokinetic studies. And despite despite it being felt that there's very little information in pediatrics, there's still a lot of information that is available. According to the Annex of Directive 2001/83, the information that should be present at that point is quite a lot. For example, at that point, at the end of phase 1, there is already information known about the active substance. That substance has been converted into pharmaceutical form, which has then been used in a pharmacokinetic clinical trial within adults. So, as I said, there's information known about the active substance itself, the characteristics of that substance, its solubility, and other aspects that would be important in terms of defining exactly what sort of information would be needed regarding the formulation, whether or not specific formulation technology will be needed, whether or not those solvents will be needed, dispersions, other interesting aspects, what specific excipients might be needed, and the amount they would need to go and sort of help facilitate the use of the formulation, whether or not the organoleptic properties of the substance require taste masking, which would be important for pediatrics, and other considerations, whether other pharmaceutical forms were considered at that early stage. Information is also known about the basic PK characteristics of the product. And then from that, whether there is any differences between the human and the animal information in terms of non-clinical aspects. There will be information available also on the initial tolerability of the product within healthy subjects. And that in itself can then lead to information about the therapeutic index and the PK/PD profile of the product itself. On the basis of that can then lead to inferences being created about the likelihood for dose flexibility or dose banding or rounding in the pediatric population, and again, whether or not sort of other dosage forms or liquids might be necessary. Now, on the basis of that, then the applicant should then ask themselves, well, what is the logical next step in their development? To my mind, the logical next step is first of all to define the relevant pediatric patient cohorts that are likely to be relevant. Sometimes because the adult development drives the initial phase 1, the question then is whether or not the condition that is applicable in pediatrics. Are there any waivers that might be needed? And on the basis of that, to define exactly what cohorts will be contained within the PIP and which ones are likely not to be. Now, it's important that all cohorts in which the medicine is likely to be used should be considered. And depending on some genetic subtypes, or genetic conditions rather, it may well be that sort of while the condition itself may not clinically present up to a certain point, if a sibling has had a genetic diagnosis, then a subsequent sibling may receive the medicine at an earlier stage than they would otherwise do if it was just for therapeutic use or a treatment use. So once that has been defined exactly what the pediatric age cohorts, then the applicant should then define exactly how the known information applies to those age cohorts. So, for example, for pharmacokinetic information, if the information is known about how the substance is metabolized and excreted, then depending on the developmental characteristics of the particular age cohort, that might lead to changes or in the handling of that particular active substance. So the question then is, well, what additional information is needed? How are we going to extrapolate from the knowns to the unknowns to create a model, and then how to determine how that model should be validated? And it's that validation exercise that forms the basis of the evolutionary measure that is contained within the PIP. And then that is carried on as a sequential process. Once you've defined one, then you can then define exactly, well, if we know this information, we can do this. On the basis of this step, we'll do the next step, and then cascade that through the entire development process up to and including the clinical trials. If a step is clear and easily defined, then that can be added to the PIP as a defined measure. So, for example, it's quite clear that, for example, if the formulation, for example, used in adults is a monolithic large solid tablet, but the condition is applicable in in younger children, then it'll be quite clear that a defined measure will be to change the form of the modifier and adapt the form to one that is more acceptable in that population. If the excipients that are used in the adult formulation are such that they cannot be used safely in younger children, then a clear defined measure is to go and modify the formulation so that those excipients are either modified or changed to ones that are more appropriate in that population, or that the concentrations are modified to make them more appropriate. So those are the defined measures. However, if a step is uncertain, so for example, you will need to go and define exactly what the PK characteristics in young patients for whom renal system might be immature, then extrapolation will be created and a measure or to validate that. So, for example, a clinical study in which PK data is gathered in those children and sufficient PK data to go and validate the model will be put in as a contingent step. As the contingent measures are put in, it will be accepted or understood that as information matures within development, the contingent measures will then become less uncertain, less ill-defined, and the applicant will then come back and prospectively update the PIP to go and clarify or more readily define the subsequent measures down that. And that would happen prospectively prior to the start of the measure for which it applies, so that both the regulator and the applicant can be clear that the information that will be generated from that measure, then the subsequent measures are reliable and robust, so that proper regulatory decisions can be made at a later stage. This is better than the other situation that currently occurs, where an arbitrary measure may be put in and then needs to be a discussion needs to be had about sort of how that should be changed. It's better to come with information saying, well, we have this ill-defined measure at the moment, but it is based on this information we have. We have improved that information, and now we are able to go and properly define this measure. It may be at the end decade that sort of if applicants do not come back and if contingent measures do remain at the end of the development period, that may be appropriate. It may be that sort of that's just the way the development worked. However, if applicants did not engage and come back prospectively as they should have done, that a reward review step in the post-assessment phase may be possible, and that's sort of contained within the pediatric regulation. That if an assessment procedure of an application feels that sort of the PIP was not in conformity, the plan was not in conformity with the plan, then they may decide a case that the rewards that are provided under the regulation may not necessarily apply. I mean, ultimately, we want to be helpful. We want to be flexible and to help applicants navigate these uncertainties. But if it is a case that sort of trust is abused, then we may need to be firm to try and help ensure that developments that are done in children are done appropriately, so that reliable and robust data can be created, as this is ultimately for the betterment of treatment of the pediatric population. There is a gap, to my perception, within the regulations at the moment, insofar as the PIP is assessed at the European level, at the centralised level, but clinical trials themselves are assessed at the National Competent Authority. And therefore, it will be important for NCAs to help promote concordance with the measures that are contained within the various PIPs. And CT assessors can help do that. They can look at a pediatric trial that's coming in, determine if it is part of the PIP, look at the trial as being proposed and the PIP as agreed, and decide if there's agreement or concordance between those two measures. If it is a case that the study is part of an evolutionary PIP, and the applicant was supposed to come back in advance of that the NCA can advise an applicant or the sponsor of that case, and therefore allow the sponsor time to come back to the PDCO to agree this contingent measure prior to the start of the study, to ensure that the study that is then carried out is robust enough to go and feed into the authorization stages at a later point. The NCA can also advise the sponsor of the risk that they might face to their compliance statement or the reward if studies are not done in line with the PIP, especially if it is related to contingent measures. I'm going to finally wrap up this particular talk by referring to the network strategy document that was published by the European Medicines Agencies, the HMA and the European Medicines Agency, out to 2025. One of the key things that's going to be important over the next couple of years, as we start moving into newer paradigms of the regulation of trials in smaller populations, the building of the real-world evidence platforms, the evolution of databases and other aspects, is that there's going to be a need for strong collaboration between the various different stakeholder groups within the regulatory network. And that is the regulators themselves, industry, academia, patients, healthcare providers, payers. There are so many, and they've all fed into this document. It's important. Part of the reason why this collaboration with other stakeholders is so beneficial is, from a procedural point of view, it allows timely input into the active procedures, and that can then go and help inform those procedures such that the outcomes are reflective of the needs of the various different stakeholders. It can also then formulate and facilitate timely conversion of these improved practices and knowledge into more structured guidance documents. And this is particularly important for rare disease and pediatric illnesses, because quite often the specific aspects of these smaller populations are not reflected adequately in the existing guidance documents. And as well as that, quite often there's quite a long turnover time in the revision of guidance documents, which may not necessarily reflect the fast-moving changes that are occurring at the cold face. So having these collaborative efforts and having stakeholders involved within the network is very important to allow the best information that can be generated at a particular time to be reflected within regulatory practices. So it's one of the tasks that I hope to carry out as part of my tenure as chair, is to go and improve the interaction between the various different stakeholder groups. All of this is under the umbrella of the ongoing revision to the pediatric regulation, which is occurring at the commission level. This has been ongoing for about 2 years or so, and has been based in part on the outcome of the 10-year review of the pediatric regulation, which occurred back in 2017-2018. As part of that, one of the two key aspects that were identified was the trying to define exactly the definition of unmet medical need when it comes to both rare diseases and pediatric illnesses, and also the review of the incentive structures that are currently in place within both the pediatric regulation and the orphan regulation for orphan medicinal products. So it'll be interesting to see exactly what comes from that. We're expecting to go and an update to come from the Commission in the first half of next year, and on the basis of that, then further discussions will be taken and will be carried out. Anyway, we'll stop here. I said sorry I couldn't actually be there in person, but I'm grateful for your attention, and if there are any questions from the audience, then I'm happy to try and answer these as best I can. If they're sent to the organisers, then subsequently sent to me, I will try and get back to them. So thank you very much.